Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for the return of the PTRC Fireside Chats. Just wanted to give you a quick introduction about PTRC. We are a training company based in the UK, which specializes in the training of transport planners, engineers, designers, and placemakers. PTRC is part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, the membership organization for professionals leading the movement of goods and people. We've had some great conversations with these fireside chats in the past, and I'm looking forward to seeing what our expert panel has to say today. I'm handing over to Glenn now, who will be your chair for today. Have fun.
Thank you, Brogan. And as you can see, I've dressed up specially for this first event in our new series, dug out from the wardrobe my old uniform from generations ago. So hello, everyone. We're back. What started as a one-off PTRC Fireside Chat in April last year, 1 month into the lockdown in the UK, it then became a Fireside Chat series. And the 2020-2021 series covered 10 events on different topics, but all relating to the pandemic and its implications for transport. We had over 50 different panelists and over 2,800 individuals from across the world who registered to participate in one or more of the events. Broad and I decided to take a breather over the summer, but we just couldn't resist coming back for more. So here we are. My name's Glenn Lyons, if you don't know me, and I'm the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at University of the West of England in Bristol in the UK. And I'm delighted to be chairing this PTRC event, the first, I suppose, in our 2021-22 Fireside Chat series. We're here to discuss what could lie ahead for the future of work, especially knowledge work, as well as what this means for transport. A very warm welcome to our audience. Do please make use of the chat window on YouTube to share your views and raise questions you'd like our panel to address. And a warm welcome too to our panel for today. Before we hear from them and contemplate what is to become of knowledge workers in the wake of the pandemic, I'd like to offer some scene setting. I vividly remember my first day of working from home. It was in 1995. And perhaps behind me, you can see a cartoon taken from Computing magazine that same year. Although the World Wide Web had been invented 6 years earlier, there was no digital connectivity involved for me that day. I'd been allowed to borrow an older 286 computer from the university. It didn't have Windows on it, but it did have Microsoft Word that ran in DOS and a floppy disk drive. Some of you might be wandering back down memory lane with me at that point, but others will be wondering what on earth I'm talking about. It felt like an immense privilege to spend that day working at home in place of my 35-mile commute. I was very conscious that I was out of sight at home and being trusted to be productive away from the office. I think it might have blown my mind in 1995 had I been given a glimpse into my working practices here today, a quarter of a century later. Well, working practices, of course, have been changing for some time in an evolutionary manner. According to the National Travel Survey for England, between 1997 and 2017, over that 20-year period, the average number of commuting trips per person per year went down by nearly a fifth, and business trips by over a quarter. As the digital age and the motor age collided and merged, changing working practices were changing work-related travel. And change is often incremental, if powerfully cumulative in this way. It's evolutionary. But then the working revolution of 2020 arrived as we were all thrown into a global behaviour change experiment. It was like the flick of a switch as lockdown was imposed on us. As knowledge workers in particular, we quickly adapted, some more easily than others. We had saved commuting and business travel time that we could now reinvest. A daily walk was one form of reinvestment. We began honing our IT skills and becoming familiar with the etiquette of Teams and Zoom calls. Saved travel time, bit by bit, was consumed over the months that unfolded by a new build-up of multi-way online meetings and workshops. How would we ever have time to travel for work anymore, even if the chance were given to us again? Those with caring responsibilities found working from home a mixed blessing. And for those with children, homeschooling was a rude awakening in many cases. For some, the new way of work was a reprieve from the rat race and its incessant work travel. For others, it proved to be a socially isolating experience. People's well-being was put to the test. What became very clear was that it seemed it was possible in many cases to carry on being economically productive without leaving our homes for work. Very quickly, minds turned to what this might mean for the future. Just because we could work in this way didn't mean we wanted to or necessarily would in future, at least not all of the time. Indications from surveys looking ahead have been that there is broad appeal for workers of hybrid working, splitting time between the home and the office. Meanwhile, we've seen quite varied reactions from employers. Back to business seems to be the mantra in some cases, espousing the values of co-location for productivity, career development, and well-being. In others, it's your work, your way, seeking to respect employees' preferences from where, when, and how they think they work best. But is there an obvious new way of working that suits everyone? In other words, will post-COVID expectations and norms of working practices in an organisation reflect the sum of individual workers' preferences? And if not, who wins, who loses, and who decides? With the arrival of a vaccine and subsequent relaxation of restrictions, all of this is being put to the test. And what might this mean for commuting and business travel of knowledge workers, both domestically and internationally? What happens to the market for public transport operators? Do modest savings in travel time from investment in transport improvements matter as much anymore when deciding not to travel might be the most appealing option? And what does this mean for the economic case for new transport investments? Meanwhile, what is to become of our cities that have relied upon the daily influx of knowledge workers to help urban economic life to flourish? What longer term effects are we going to see on geographic distribution of the knowledge worker population with the spatial and temporal flexibility that this new world of working may offer? And should we be seizing the opportunity for less work-related travel as part of our collective efforts to tackle the code red for humanity that is climate change? Well, as we can see, the questions just keep coming, and finding the answers over the months and years ahead amounts to trying to hit a set of moving targets. At this stage, we can only speculate in our exploration of the possibilities and uncertainties ahead, yet explore we must. So let's begin today's expedition and turn to our panel of intrepid explorers, invite them to share their opening thoughts. Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Glenn. Well, my name is Alan Felsted, and I work at the School of Social Sciences here at Cardiff University in sunny Wales. It is very sunny today, actually. The last 18 months has ushered in what many have called the Great Home Working Experiment, as there was a sudden and dramatic shift in the location of work. In my opening remarks, I want to make a number of points. The first point I want to make is that home working is actually nothing new. It's been going on for centuries, but the Industrial Revolution meant that for many of us, most of us, before the pandemic, it was a backwater subject, with a fairly strict divide between the places where people worked and the places where people lived. When I started investigating working at home in the 1990s, it did not refer to knowledge workers at all, but to those working in the boot and shoe trade and the clothing industry, as well as packers and assemblers of items such as Christmas crackers, handbags, nappies, children's toys, the list goes on. These workers were often off the books, lowly paid and vulnerable to exploitation. That said, home working was growing before the pandemic and extending gradually into white-collar work. But the change was slow and gradual. It was evolution, as Glenn said. It was relatively rare in the early 1980s, for example, when only 2% of those in employment in the UK reported working mainly at home. But by 2019, before the pandemic, it had risen to 5%. So it had taken 40 years to rise by a mere 3 percentage points. The pandemic, of course, turbocharged this shift. The proportion of people reporting working at home rose to a massive 43% in April 2020. During 2020 itself, between 12 and 6 million people were working exclusively at home. That's a lot of people. It was no longer a backwater subject. Everyone was talking about it. It was frequently in the news. For example, newspaper articles in the UK on working at home rose from around 150 per month before the outbreak of COVID-19 to a monthly peak of almost 6,000 in March 2020. However, the growth in home working was not evenly spread. After all, some jobs simply cannot be done at home, and those that can tend to be of a particular type. The largest surges in home working were recorded among the most privileged segments of the labour market, the better educated, the higher skilled, and the higher paid. That is to say, the type of probably people on this call today. That's very different to the profile of home worker that I was looking at in the 1990s, and a huge change in fortunes. Despite employer concerns, 70% of these new home workers said they were able to get the same, if not more, done while working at home than they were able to do in the office. Employers too did not report productivity falling off a cliff. Around 70% of employers said that shift to home working had not dented productivity. That does, of course, leave around a quarter of employees and employers who reported falls in productivity. Home working, after all, is not for everyone. For example, those who worked at home often found it difficult to unwind at the end of the working day. They were more likely to work longer hours and had greater difficulty switching off. And those with limited space and domestic commitments found it particularly difficult. Finally, the last 18 months or so has been about working at home. I'm emphasizing the word at there, with little, if any, movement at all. The future, however, is likely to be very different. There are benefits of office work that we cannot simply create online, despite our best efforts. Social bonding, incremental learning, increasing your chances of promotion, and serendipitous knowledge exchange are all best achieved by bringing people together in the same space. It is for these reasons that hybrid working is getting a lot of attention, as workers and employers try to harness the best of both worlds. Governments too can see the benefits of reducing the need for commuting that Glenn has outlined earlier, and hence the need to reduce traffic and pollution. For example, in recognition of these potential benefits, the Welsh Government is aiming to get 30% of workers working at or near to their homes in the future. For this reason, I would add a big question mark to the big return title of this chat, since I don't think that the return will ever be totally complete.
That's great, Alan. Thank you very much. I must admit, whilst I've been excited and impressed by the Welsh Government's 30% commitment, as it were, judging whether or not that is under ambitious or over ambitious is hard to determine, I think, from some of the figures you've given us there. I think you've also reminded us, of course, about the diversity of experience, and you've set me thinking that perhaps those of us that are in more privileged positions who could adapt very quickly to find that spare bedroom or that home office or the computer that was already there, moved fairly quickly to a position, at least technologically, that they could cope with. And I wonder whether it is a matter of time where, if we can see the broader population willing to work from home, but not yet enabled to, whether we'll see some innovations coming through. I certainly know of a number of colleagues who bought garden sheds that are now beautifully equipped for working from home that certainly they didn't have at the start. That's great. That's been a fantastic start for us. So Malia, if I can turn to you now for your opening thoughts. And of course, we know that we'll have something to say about commuting.
Quite a lot, actually. Thank you, Glenn. So as we know, the pandemic has been immensely challenging in so many ways. But there is a rather fat silver lining. It's brought about some real positive change to some of our most ingrained behaviours, and the way in which we travel is one of those. So there were reports at the beginning of the pandemic that around 1 million travel habits changed in the first month of the lockdown, which clearly has astronomical benefits environmentally. The scale of carbon emissions in transport in the UK is huge, and it hasn't changed that much over the last 10 years. Commuting, for example, accounts for 18 billion kilograms of CO2 annually in the UK. That's 5% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. So I work for the Lift Share Group, and as you can imagine, car sharing pretty much fell off a cliff at the beginning of the pandemic. our activity to our user platform decreased by approximately 90%. This was in part down to a large number of our members working from home. And we ultimately saw that as a really good thing. Carbon emission rates were plummeting. So a survey we did in April 2021, looking at commuter travel behaviours across 6,000 of our LiftShare members, showed that commuter emissions at that time had fallen by 47% compared to pre-pandemic levels. And based on how our members anticipated commuting in 2022, so next year, we found that we are set to sustain a 26% reduction against pre-pandemic levels. And that was largely down to individuals wanting to continue to work from home. We also found that for those that anticipated commuting, so travelling, come the new year, appetite to commute sustainably was super high. 70% of our members saying that they wanted to travel sustainably, as opposed to driving on their own. So from the data we collected through our survey, we actually looked into the feasibility of people travelling sustainably based on where they lived and worked. And there were some really significant opportunities, but equally some big gaps. So of those who would consider taking public transport, for example, 55% realistically could, but 45% probably wouldn't because it would take too long. And by too long, I mean over twice the drive time. Another example was those that would consider cycling. 40% who would consider actually could cycle, 40%, and that's within 30 minutes. That's pretty cool, but 60% probably wouldn't, as it would take too long. So all of this pandemic, all these insights, we actually revised our entire mission at the LiftShare Group, and we're now on a mission to make zero carbon commuting a reality in the UK. We've pulled our behaviour change knowledge and we've developed some new tools and methodologies to help large employers benchmark, tackle and track their commuter emissions down to zero. We know that the ways in which businesses can do this is now obviously to encourage employees to work from home where they are able to and where there's a desire for them to be at home, but as well as look at the different levers that they can pull to switch behaviours from driving alone to taking a lower carbon commute, but focusing in their efforts on the opportunities that will deliver the most impact and addressing the gaps that there are in service provision. So I feel as though, and LiftShare feels, that the pandemic has shown us truly the art of the possible in terms of seriously tackling travel-related emissions, and we're really excited about it. I think what's going to be key is empowering businesses to empower their employees to make the best decisions that benefit both of those parties and the planet. That's everything from me.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Malia. And I think for a long time, I think we welcomed having kind of LiftShare as part of the transport sector, really shining a light with some hard numbers on the nature and scale of the commute challenge, and of course how you as a company have been tackling it over a long and sustained period. It does set me thinking in terms of that understandable 90% reduction that you saw, how much of that will return, and of course return with a different set of questions and requirements from LiftShare with its own new mission. I don't know whether there's anything you can say briefly on that now, just to follow up a little.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a slow return. I mean, it's going to be interesting to understand what does returning back to what. I feel that the scope for LiftShare is significant. We know that 92% of commuters, for example, have at least one person that they could reasonably share, share their journey into work. That's 92% of all commuters in the UK. That's incredible. So the opportunity is vast. The appetite for lift sharing is increasing, and we can see that through tracking our notifications. So when there's activity on our platform, it pings out a notification. Response rates to those notifications is at an all-time high, and that's tracking back 7 years. People are really engaged when they are ready to kind of engage, but levels are still way below pre-pandemic in terms of the number of members joining and ultimately sharing, although that is increasing quite rapidly now. How that will change again when we go into the colder months, and we don't know what's going to happen over the course of the winter. So I think this is why we're trying to broaden our one of the reasons why we're trying to broaden our horizon in terms of actually for us as a business, it's about reducing commuter emissions, and whether that's people lift sharing, hopping on a bus, walking, cycling, it's all good. Working from home, it's great. So yeah, we'll see.
Thank you. Yeah, and of course, the challenge for you and similarly for mobility as a service, as a proposition, is that to some extent, as a private sector organisation, there's the matter of selling mobility or access to mobility, and it's quite a conundrum when the most appealing thing for a net zero commute is, of course, selling the prospect that you should take advantage of being at home as much as you can, and possibly, as you mentioned, walking and cycling into the mix. I'll move over to Jo in a moment, but just perhaps leave the thought. Alan very kindly mentioned, very appropriately mentioned, the 30% figure for work at home ambitions in Wales. Many of you will be aware of, if you like, a comparable commitment in Scotland to a 20% reduction in vehicle distance travelled by the end of this decade. And I can't help but thinking that the lift share proposition has to be at the heart of that. The big challenge, I've no doubt, is how we persuade people up and down the land to recognise the motivations or to see the motivations that help them into that means of travel. So thanks, Malia. Jo, I'll pass over to you. And with reference to travel behaviour, there's probably no better person to come to in the Department for Transport.
Thanks, Glenn. Hello, everyone. So I'm Jo Bacon, of Behaviour Science, the UK Department for Transport. So I head up a team which includes a mix of social researchers and behavioural scientists, and our role is to provide and promote the use of data and evidence about people, so how they behave and why, as well as their attitudes and opinions, in order to help ensure that transport policy at the national level is informed by the experiences and attitudes of the people affected by it. So I'm really happy to be here today. I think it's going to be a really fascinating discussion. It's worth saying that any of the views I express are mine rather than those of the department. I think there are three sort of key points I wanted to make. The first is that the research shows, I think, that there's a lot of uncertainty out there, even though there's actually quite a lot of data being collected on this topic. So far, the return to the workplace has been slow and gradual, and I think this is probably going to continue, particularly with the uncertainty around the pandemic. Employee surveys indicate sort of a strong aspiration to continue at least some working from home. I think the average across surveys is around sort of 2 to 3 days per week. But employer surveys seem to show sort of high degree of don't know responses about what the future holds, particularly I think in terms of when people would come back. Overall, the data I think is pointing towards hybrid working in the future, but as Alan has pointed out, hybrid working is a very different challenge, and I think possibly a much greater challenge than everybody working from home. So at the department where I work, we've already opened up offices in cities outside of London. So hybrid working is, if you like, being sort of baked into our infrastructure. But I think there's a recognition that sort of leaving things entirely up to people's individual choice is not necessarily the most inclusive thing to do, because teams and other individuals and ultimately the organisation might benefit from you as an individual being in the office, even if that's not necessarily what you want to do. But the second key point, I think, is around diversity, and I think this is an important factor in all of this, as Glenn has referred to, and Alan also. Even though many people have had a shared experience of working from home, people's individual experiences of working from home were very different. I think that will be carried through to how things develop in the future. People will want and need different things. So I'm talking about diversity on a sort of number of different levels. So there's socio-demographic and economic characteristics such as income and ethnicity. Life stage and I think career stage is really important. people's household circumstances, as well as how employers respond. So working during the pandemic, and I think will be important in shaping the return to the workplace. And finally, the third point, a big question in all of this is obviously what it will mean for transport behaviour in the future, and therefore how transport will need to respond. I think it's too early to say definitively, but I think the situation is likely to offer sort of both opportunities and challenges. So, for example, could local communities benefit from 15 or 20-minute neighbourhoods where people could walk or cycle more to local amenities? Could there be fewer car journeys, meaning less congestion? Might people use trains for greater variety of journeys spread throughout the day and across the week? If people have less regular travel habits because they are no longer commuting to the same place every day, could they be more easily persuaded to try a bigger range of sustainable modes to meet their travel needs, like car sharing and cycling? Transport ultimately will need to adapt to and respond to and support the changes that society wants to make. But I think, to go back to where I started, there's still quite a lot of
I think we may have some uncertainty, just to finish your sentence there, Joe, with your Wi-Fi connection today, and I know that was frustrating you. I think we can all empathise with that. So hopefully, if you can hear us, Joe, you'll be back shortly. But fantastic, we captured all of your opening remarks, I think, and plenty more food for thought within that. One of the things I'm very aware of, one of the many important phrases Phil Goodwin has contributed to our understanding in this area, is that changing behaviour has two meanings: changing as in it is changing over time, and changing as in you can change it. And I suppose that's an important distinction for us now. It's not just understanding how it might change, but what agency and influence organisations, individuals, and indeed government have. Very taken, as perhaps others were, with the teaser you gave us about how perhaps the civil service is behaving, or at least your team within that, in terms of the flexibility to redistribute across different offices where one's dealing with big enough organisations that they have that network of locations. Interestingly, just last night, the event I was at, looking a little bit as smart as I am today, at the University of the West of England, was the distinguished address from my top boss in Mott MacDonald, our executive chair, Mike Haig, and he was explaining that the Mott MacDonald policy at this point for supporting that flexibility, to some extent, is very much your work, your way, but encouraging an 8 days per month approach to flexibility. And I think that distinction between calling it 2 days a week and 8 days a month is perhaps quite revealing of how we can become more flexible. Also, Joe, and I'm not sure whether you're back with us or whether we're sort of seeing a ghost from the past playing out on screen for us, but you touched upon, well, for me at least, the distinction between selfish and cooperative behaviour, and that was really thought-provoking, this idea that if we simply let all of us do what we want, some of us will achieve what we want, and it will be at the cost to some others benefiting from the way that they would like to work. And the question I'm going to leave, perhaps Alan and Joe, which we'll come back to, because I'm going to move on to Jonathan. Hopefully Joe will rejoin us fully shortly. And since I know Alan has been researching this field for many, many years, he'll probably say no to this question. But my question is, were we doing enough research on flexible working before COVID to equip ourselves with the sort of understanding we should have had all along about travel being a derived demand and what the implications are for changing working practices for travel? Or doesn't it matter now because all bets are off, everything's been thrown up in the air? So one for you to come back to, Alan. But Jonathan, if I may, can we hand over the baton to you, please?
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me to this discussion. I'm Jonathan Bray, Director of the Urban Transport Group. That brings together the public sector transport authorities for the largest city regions, Transport for London, Transport for Greater Manchester, Transport for West Midlands, and so on, serving 20 million people across the largest urban areas. That's all we are. public sector transport authorities. So I guess I give a perspective on what the potential future of the office is for looking at it from the point of view of people who are trying to provide public transport and active travel provision in the city regions with a public service outlook rather than a commercial outlook. So what's going to happen with the office return? Nobody knows for sure. Nobody knows anything. As I think someone wrote about the Hollywood film industry, but I think the smart money is probably that we'll muddle our way towards some kind of hybrid of hybrids, as in there'll be some outliers. Some people will give up the office altogether. Some will be back completely. The rest will kind of muddle their way through to some kind of hybrid home and office working. But again, it's too early to say for sure. We can't know for sure yet. From the perspective of public transport operators, this has wrecked the finances of public transport and projections about what kind of public transport revenue subsidy split will be in the future. And it's that short-term financial concerns as we hobble from one deal, government support, which has been very welcome in keeping public transport going. That has been achieved, but it's not an indefinite guarantee from Treasury, and we await the outcomes of the spending review with some trepidation. Of course, alongside the challenge of keeping the wheels turning week by week, responding to whatever these unknown changing travel patterns are, we also want to and are expected to deliver on the objectives of transport decarbonisation plan and our own desires to radically increase modal share for public transport and active travel. We can talk more about some of the issues around office return as the discussion unfolds, but I think if we could get out from under short-term financial crisis, what we should be thinking about is around public transport. What does it look like in the future? If the peak is less pronounced, then are we looking at something that is a more even service across the day? We know that leisure is the growth point for public transport. In fact, some of the public transport ridership on our networks has been well above what it was pre-pandemic on weekends. So leisure is the growth area. But what does that say about the type of public transport we provide? I think particularly on rail, which has also been the biggest loser from the pandemic of all the modes, people were prepared to cram onto old and new trains. Seems like the new trains are slightly more uncomfortable than the old ones, and the operators could make them look like something that would have been in the GDR if it had survived, and people would still pile on. But are we now more in a buyer's market than a seller's market? And if public transport is there to accommodate its growth market of leisure, do we actually need different types of rolling stock and a different approach to how passengers are treated? So I think that's some of the challenges it would be good to wrestle with. I think we've got a difficult winter potentially ahead. We were perhaps all hoping that the winter would have properly got started before we were on the verge of another sub-crisis within the overall crisis, and potentially another instruction for people not to work in offices, which will further upend the finances of public transport, which are already in somewhat parlous state. But we'll have to see. Maybe as we come out of the other side of the winter, we might get a better idea of how some of these trends are unfolding. But I think as well, it's also finally, I think it's worth bearing in mind that most people, particularly in some areas, have never been part of this home working thing. One statistic I think I've got here, 44% never worked from home for one day during the pandemic. If you go to places like, this is trying to find a statistic, where was it? Burnley, lost it here. Burnley, Stoke and Barnsley, only 2 out of 10 people could work from home. So we need to be alive, as in many parts of the transport debate. Usually we end up really just talking about, in our heads, we're talking about Islington, Hackney and central London, whereas there's a totally different travel patterns, totally different geographies, totally different economies for most people in this country, and the pandemic has exposed that, and also the differentials. It's putting new differentials on transport. You know, you go to Greater Manchester, the first place to return to 100% footfall was Wigan. And that's partly because most people never, you know, there's not that many jobs that people work from home anyway. So there's been a lot of big changes within the overall, you know, that people like us love to talk endlessly about the office return. It's an endless subject that never stops giving. But in fact, for a lot of people, it's pretty irrelevant. So, but anyway, I'll stop there, and I'm sure we'll return to some of these themes during the discussion.
That's great. Thanks, Jonathan. And yeah, I'm pleased that you really highlighted for us that distinction perhaps between, I must admit, I'm often guilty of thinking, when I talk urban, of thinking big urban centres and major cities, particularly thinking around the UK, and that reminder that there are many urban areas that have a different complexion. Although I'm curious, and again, we can only speculate, I suppose, but your 2 out of 10 in Burnley, Stoke and Barnsley that can work from home, of course, reflects people's home location choices and employment choices pre-COVID. And now we're in a position where huge swathes of people who can work from home in terms of their job type may be looking to relocate to attractive properties in the smaller towns and districts, as opposed to some of the bigger cities where, you know, beyond rent affordabilities for purchasing is difficult. So of course it starts to open up the huge ripple effects this could be having on the housing market. And I know we'll perhaps come to a couple of Sean Hellman's comments from the audience once we've been through the introductions, but anything briefly on that from your point of view, Jonathan, or is it purely speculation at this stage?
Well, there is a Goldilocks scenario, because you could say we've had an economic model which is certainly in city regions outside London, it's all been about the core city. Cities were king of the castle, and everywhere else your best hope was that people would live there to commute into the city. But now we're seeing the revenge of those secondary places, and it's the biggest city centres where the footfall is relatively lowest. You know, so London, Manchester, so footfall at some stage in the pandemic was 43% London, 60% Leeds, 53% in Birmingham. At the same time, it was 92% in Swansea and 83% in Barnsley. So, and there's lots of fantastic Victorian heritage buildings, which would make superb offices and superb places to live and work. You know, I always think of Batley, home of the Batley Variety Club. Some of those buildings are just sensational, and if they're in London, they'll be snapped up. At the moment, they're empty, in danger of accidentally burning down and all those kind of things. So is there a Goldilocks scenario where people repopulate those secondary centres and people have to commute into the city centre? It's not all about the biggest centres, but those centres still retain their vibrancy and their big attractions. But will we get a more balanced distributed economy? That's, I think, what's driving what the Welsh are saying with their plan for, you know, can we get people working in their homes in parts of Wales, not all commuting into Cardiff and Swansea? That's the dream. But does it need stimulating? Will it happen anyway? We'll have to wait and see. But I think, again, the danger is we're so focused on sorting out the immediate crisis, we're not necessarily thinking about these bigger opportunities that are out there. And also, I think there's a slight danger we've got locked into a kind of cities v towns battle of each of them slagging each other off, whereas, you know, urban geographies are a bit more complicated than that as well, and there is more interdependency and a more mature debate perhaps around conurbations and where the economic activity might be cited would be perhaps where we need to move into. Fantastic.
I thought I could almost see levelling up on the tip of your tongue there, but and my goodness me, if you whisper that in the ear of a couple of ministers, they might just realise that Goldilocks is there on the doorstep waiting to make their dreams come true. But yeah, some great insight, as you say, into sort of the economic geography that we'll need to be dealing with. Right, last but not least, and I'm going to be cheeky and invite our compassionately ruthless gorilla, Halina, to make her introductory remarks. Over to you, Halina.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Halina Yaroshevska, and definitely into mischief and mayhem and provoking thoughts. So I'm going to use the compassionately ruthless gorilla as an example of what doesn't work when discussions are happening about how we're going to work in the future. I attended a workshop and we had to describe ourselves and what we did in 3 words. I came up with compassionately ruthless disruptor. Disruptor was thrown out of the window by the presenter who suggested gorilla, and I went along with it. And that's what is my concern, is that a lot of people are going to go along with what is suggested about the working going forward. The word that sat best with me when I thought about it afterwards, because I had to explain gorilla to lots of people that it wasn't one, it was the other, was provocateur or alchemist. And that's what I think I'm here as. Because I don't come from one of the big organisations. I haven't done lots of research into transport and things, but I have got my finger on the pulse about how people are thinking about working, and working either from home or at home. There was a conversation about what that was. And my question, I guess, to start off with is, who's holding the power in this? And it's interesting that Alan was saying that in the click of a finger, we switched from, all the commuting stuff to the office. The people that did it, because there were a lot of people still, as being alluded to, that couldn't work from home. But Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, said, we've seen 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. A client that I was working with when we went into the first lockdown here, which I thought was far too late, said that it was amazing that we could suddenly work from home over a weekend. And that conversation, to get that in place, would have taken at least 5 years, she felt, in her business, with lots of objections, lots of sabotage, but it happened in the click of a finger or the flash of an eyelash. And I think what's caused quite a lot of upset for people maybe at the top or middle management is that brilliant 5-letter word called trust. And I'm wondering, how does trust show up? How does it play a part? How can managers and leaders of businesses actually trust their employees? And if they don't, there's obviously the rust in that things go belly up, I think. And I've got a couple of quotes that I came across the other day that I'm going to sprinkle in. So Peter Drucker, a guru, said the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the actual turbulence, it's to act with yesterday's logic. And that is what I am concerned we're going to do. Because I think what's happened over the past 2 years, I'm really lucky. I need to have my hand up. I'm really lucky. 75% of my work has always been virtual. I work internationally. People don't fly me out for an hour's work with a leader in an organisation. They'd rather not, well, just pay for it on Zoom, I guess. So I've been lucky. I've had work coming in. I've kept going. It's brilliant. That hasn't been the same for everybody. And I also have a sense there's been and I think it's been alluded to too, is that there's been an insidious creep of work into personal lives. Working at home or from home really needs clear boundaries. Whoops. So does working in the office. And I think we find it really hard probably to do both. There's a suggestion that maybe we should treat weekends as a vacation, that you actually switch your mobile off. People are going into shock and having to have therapy at the thought of that, I'm sure. But actually give your mobile a holiday. Don't be tied to it. It's not that important, really. When I go out for a walk, I will actually leave my mobile at home because it just needs a rest. And it's important also, not when you are taking some time out, not to say, I'm put an out of office message on, but message me, I'll be online. But it's saying, I'm offline, don't call. Nothing is that important. No one is going to die if a call isn't returned in a work situation, within, 10 minutes, half an hour. It's just get real about it, really. And I think it's also important, and I think this links into some of the questions we're going to talk about. It's really important to set goals publicly as a team, as a department, as a company, as an organisation, not for it to be imposed from the top, not to be forced from coming up, but to be a collaborative effort, because it's maybe saying start with what works, but then what works might not work for everyone. I'm throwing out lots of thinking points, I think. And it's also about working at home, from home, or in the office. It's not going along with the deadlines that you're given to be put under pressure. So on a Friday, someone says, I want this back by 9 o'clock on Monday morning. Where does your weekend go? It's actually making sure that you start getting a balance to recover from the pressure that we all have when we're working. It's doing, I was challenged the other day to take 10 minutes to walk and simply observe. Do nothing else, simply observe. And it was fascinating seeing a ladybird, seeing how the leaves have just started changing colour. And it's putting those sort of things into our lives that when you think of the rat race or the commute, it's how many people actually in that commute would have stopped or paused or looked and seen what was happening, maybe just smiled at someone. No, it would have been, I've got to get to the office. So I think those things are changing. Then I have a question. Can we create a company or organisation culture if we're not all in the office? If there are hybrid meetings, where should the leader be? On Zoom or in the meeting room? What are the implications of tech? What is out there that we have not yet dreamed of? I was challenged to think 5 years ahead, and I was thinking I can't even think one day ahead at the moment because things are really changing so quickly. So what is happening out there that's going to really shake our world up again? And then I came back to words like it's how can we be kind to ourselves and each other? How can we be tolerant? How can we be clear with our choices? And then I'd like to finish with a Nobel Prize winner quote, Albert Georgi. He said, discovery consists of seeking what everybody else has seen and then thinking what no one else has thought. And I just thought that was brilliant. And I'm going to challenge us that we see what we expect to see. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Helena. And as with the others, I've been scribbling like mad with all sorts of thoughts, which in a sense is even more distressing because you realise ever more how much you don't know and just how many more questions are being added to the list. I was very taken, you had this lovely phrase, acting with yesterday's logic. And for me, that kind of resonates with a more grandiose term called cognitive fluency, which is this idea that, we're very good at working within the bounds of what we know, and what we know and understand is more believable than what we don't know or have never explored. And so looking forwards, there's such a powerful temptation, whether it's in the workplace or perhaps in terms of the reconfiguration of public transport, or rethinking policies around both work and transport, that we're almost prisoners inside that cognitive fluency unless we overcome the fact that it's an unconscious bias that we can wrestle with. I just wondered very briefly, in your dealings with those levels of management and leaders in organizations, do you get a sense that they are alive to the opportunity to be alchemists, or are they really acting with yesterday's logic and desperately need your help?
I don't think anyone desperately needs my help. They might appreciate it. What I'm picking up really strongly, and at the moment I'm doing a lot of work within the not-for-profit organisations, and I'm not sure how, right, I'm going to assume none of them are listening in at the moment, which would be good. Right, I'm going to be completely blunt. It's the dyed-in-the-wool political people at the top who like to have everything as it has been and are not open to seeing what can change. And you were talking about cognitive fluency, and it reminded me of one of my favourite concepts, which is cognitive dissonance, is that we go along and make things work in order that we take away the stress that gets caused. And actually, it's coming on to the question a bit later on. We've got the COVID-19 in all its various forms forever. It's not going away. There's a new variant just floating around at the moment that's causing a bit of a hiccup in the southwest. And it's how can we live with that and make the best possible results and solutions for each of us.
Great. Okay, let me pause it there, Helena. Thank you all for your introductions. When they're more than introductions, because they're just giving us a bountiful supply of thought provocation. Joe, hoping that you're back with us, I posed a question to you and Alan, really, but I'll let you take it first and then over to Alan. With the benefit of hindsight, I suppose, but also looking forwards, did we really ever do enough research? And I don't mean we necessarily, the Department for Transport, or we UK research councils, but in the round, do you think we were doing enough research into understanding flexible working as a key determinant of travel demand? And would that have made much difference now that we've come to this real shock to the system where all previous bets were off? Any thoughts on that?
So I'm a researcher. I'm always going to say we should have done more research. It would have been a good thing to do more research. So yes, I mean, we did, DFT, we did do some research on this some years ago. I guess we were focusing on some of the questions we were interested in at the time, which was around sort of the impacts on decarbonisation. So it was looking at things like people's behaviour and did they travel less if they were working from home or more, and actually found that people travelled, they did different journeys, but they did more local journeys as home workers. I think, though, that in the past, and this slightly reflects my own experience, I suppose, I've worked at home for quite some time, 1 day a week, and I think in the past it was something that was almost seen as, this is, you need to have a special reason to do this. So it was probably certain sectors of the workforce that were doing it more. So where I worked, it was women, typically more women with children. So yeah, if we had done more research, I don't know how representative it would have been of what's happening now.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. And without loading even more of a question onto Alan, but anything you'd like to add to that, Alan? But I suppose the question now going forwards is, how do we do research to keep up with things when it's in such a dynamic state of flux? Over to you, Alan.
Well, like Joe, I'm a researcher, so I'm clearly going to say more research. But I think looking back, I'm putting my hand up. I was guilty of this. I think the research that we did was probably focusing on the wrong target. There was a huge amount of interest when I was doing working at home on not working at home, but actually mobile working. And there was a massive increase in mobile working. In sociology, there was called the mobility term. It was not the spatial term, the mobility term. Mobility became the thing to study. In fact, your title, Glenn, is Professor of Future Mobility. And actually, what we're looking at now is the immobility of work. So we really missed a trick. We were really studying the wrong thing. But the evidence, the data was suggesting that when I look at the evidence, the big story wasn't working at home. It was a small change. Where the change was, though, was in terms of people working mobile, using trains, cars, planes, those kind of things, because of technology allowed you to work in a variety of places. That was the big story. And I followed that story. As did the research councils and many others. But we were missing the trick. And COVID-19 all of a sudden came, and it was immobility that hit us, not mobility. And that's why I'm particularly keen on the expression work at home, because I think it gives a greater sense of fixity than from. From is a sense in which I might do some of my work here, but I might do some of my work elsewhere. I might be on the train, plane, or coffee shop, wherever. So I do think the terminology we use should change. And the last 18 months have been about a particular form of immobility and a form where we are working at home. And that's why I'm emphasizing that. I think we're moving to a situation now of from, where we might have work from home. That might mean some of the time in the office, some of the time at home, some of the time in the local neighborhood, the 15 to 20 minute neighborhood, the local hubs, all these kind of things. But it's more about mobility. The answer in terms of, do we know a lot about how hybrid works? No, we don't. The short answer, we just don't. And I think Jonathan used the term, and I like it. We're muddling through. That's what we're doing. We're muddling through. There isn't a body of research that we can draw upon. There needs to be. This is a research opportunity, of course, for people like me, of course, to plow into, because it's happening now. It's a moving target. So I think we've got to be look back and think we missed a bit of a trick there. That we were looking at the wrong thing, possibly. Did we expect COVID-19 to have this huge change? People like me was working in this area. It was called a backwater. I was asked, several people asked me, why are you looking at working at home, Al, in the 1990s, the year 2000? See, this is not a big issue. Well, it certainly has been a big issue now. We're playing catch up.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And you mentioned, the distinction between working at home and from home, but coming across to Sean Hellman's points that he's made, and I'll perhaps pass this to Malia in the first instance, and then Jonathan. So maybe a bit challenging to think on your feet with this, Malia, but Sean, for me, was getting at two things really. One was perhaps how the way the housing market works, the sorts of details people will be looking for now will be very much about, will I be able to work flexibly in this dwelling in terms of fitting my family in or however I'm cohabiting. But also, I think Sean's other point was with reference to working hubs. And I wonder to what extent that has ever featured up to now with LiftShare's business, so that the origin and destination are not, well, not that they ever were, but the destination for work is no longer necessarily what used to be the workplace. And as Joe referred to, even within an organization, a set of offices open up to become available. Do you see any issues within there in terms of how that's affecting people's patterns of work?
Right, so I guess just to go back to the first one, the estate agents, and thinking about houses and how we use houses. I mean, I'm actually now looking to buy a house for the first time. So I can only go by my own desire. I absolutely wish that estate agents would describe houses in terms of how we can use these as an office space and what potential there would be outside to build an office space, get one of those garden sheds somebody referred to earlier. So I think that's definitely changing as somebody who's in the market to buy a house. With regards to the second point, connectivity, enabling shared office hubs. Firstly, I absolutely love that idea of going to coffee shops that have work desks that you can hire for £7 a day and have your coffee and lunch and whatever else is happening and has been happening for a while. I would definitely use that space to get that kind of social hit and more of a collaborative space connecting with colleagues. In terms of how that can work for LiftShare, yes, absolutely it can work for LiftShare and has worked for LiftShare. I mean, LiftShare is about going from A to B, and tomorrow that might be from A to C, and that's absolutely fine. LiftShare is about connecting with people, who are making a similar journey, having a relationship with someone where you can, you might share with Bob once a week, and then the next day you might share with Sharon to a different location. I mean, that's how it should work. So what we're trying to do consistently with our technology is ensure that the way in which people want to travel and how that's evolving in terms of the instantness of, it's not like necessarily lift sharing is picking up your bicycle and just going. There has to be some sort of arrangement, is making sure that our technology can cater for that, those aspects of it. But yeah, absolutely, it has worked, will work, should work. moving forward in that way.
Well, good luck with the house hunting as well. I'm
you.
sure we'll all be keen to hear back on that. And it really does open your mind, doesn't it, to what we're looking for when we're looking for a dwelling, which is no longer just a home, but a home and a place of work, and maybe a place of socialization in terms of the digital connectivity being important as well. Jonathan, I just wonder, and again, I'm sorry to keep coming to you with perhaps the speculative end, but do you, looking forwards, imagining a situation where towns and cities throughout the land are adapting, perhaps where we've got what were vacant properties on the high street to becoming working hubs, perhaps the cafe culture intensifies, perhaps we see properties that are slightly bigger outside of our core urban areas becoming more attractive just because they've got more flexibility of space. Is that part and parcel of what you were referring to earlier, that there could really be a Goldilocks opportunity in front of us? And is there anything that needs to be done by well, not necessarily your members, but the wider outreach into urban authorities? You're on mute, Jonathan.
Yeah, the main lesson we can learn from COVID is there needs to be a much bigger red button about muting and unmuting. Yes. So there is a Goldilocks scenario, which may or may not happen. It's a bit beyond our pay grade because it's less about transport than it is economic development. But if we don't think about whether we want to make that Goldilocks scenario happen, then it'll happen. It'll just happen or not. So going back to what the Welsh are trying to do, but to throw, because I don't want to back. I'm not going to back a particular horse here, I think, in terms of what might happen, but just to throw a few more things out that could happen, could all happen at the same time. The suburbs were very much reviled for many years. I mean, we've had an anti-urban culture historically in England. It was all about the suburbs, and the cities were dead spaces in the 70s. We've gone through a period of kind of continental enthusiasm about urban centres, but could it be the suburbs are now going to have a comeback? And are we going to move from what have become quite dilapidated suburbs with very few facilities, very old-fashioned, to more rejuvenated and revitalised suburbs? You can see the hipster recolonisation of the suburbs, and all suburbs of different types, from Walthamstow to classic 30 semis. And what does that mean? E-bikes, I think, could do a lot in the suburbs, given the kind of journey patterns you might get. So will there be another golden age of the suburbs as people want that nice green space where they're working more from home? And also, even people who can work from home, it's difficult for 5 people to work from home at the same time if you've got several people who need to do that at the same time. And again, that kind of classic semis might make a comeback. I think another observation is, are we going to move to less commuting but longer commuting, particularly in the southeast? Will the Cornwall effect of the wealthiest colonising all the nicest places within God knows how many hours of London, and making them unaffordable for everybody else? So it kind of happened in most of the southeast, but is it going to spread even further on the basis that people go, well, if I'm only going in twice a week, I'll do this monster train journey?
Yeah.
I think also what could happen to offices? Well, I think the City of London's quite interesting. The City of London, the heart of British capitalism, most ruthless money people in the world, are actually adopting some of the most progressive, what a lot of sustainable transport activists would say, yeah, that's what we want. 20-mile-an-hour speed limits, some beautiful urban spaces, high public transport access. They want more of that. And it's almost like they want to turn it into a campus. They want the best of the out-of-town kind of Google campus stuff, but right in the centre of London. So offices used to be very closed, black glass, can't see, you're in there, the employees are in there. Are we going to see the offices kind of open themselves up? You can already see that with the casts and the art galleries on the bottom floor, but is that going to spill out? I think someone in the city once said, I've got a beautiful office, now I want beautiful streets. Are we going to see that?
Yeah.
The campus, the best of the campus in the city. I mean, the final thing, and then I'll shut up on this particular thing, is all these Californians are always coming to us and saying, oh, we're old fashioned, we need disrupting. We've got this great new gadget that you should all adopt, whatever it is this week, e-scooters, whatever, hire bikes. taxes. But actually, it's a housing sector that needs disrupting. I mean, what are these things we keep building? How do they relate to how people actually want to live these days? Will we move to more socialised housing instead of these strange dolls' houses where people are increasingly descending into neurotic loneliness and madness? Yeah. Or will we get some disruption in the housing sector and leave us alone to get on with what we probably know we can do anyway at the moment?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great thought provocation. Helena, before we, I do want to kind of pull back very briefly in a moment to the questions we set out, which our audience will have seen as kind of promoting the event, and just get some quick thoughts from the panel. But Helena, I don't know whether you've seen Rod Fletcher's question come through into our chat, but I think he touches upon two things that were starting to also play on my mind. One is that Joe made a little bit of reference to gender and caring responsibilities, but as a panel, myself included, we really said very little about gender and indeed diversity in all its forms. But also Rod's asking, top-down power structures and office working, is there going to now be a generational change? And I wonder how that relates to your alchemy. Are different people in charge of the alchemy now than they were before, or can we look with hope to that being a possibility? And you're on mute as well, so we'll get the red button enlarged for both you and Jonathan, and probably the rest of us eventually.
I definitely do need staff on a Zoom call, definitely. That's one of the challenges of working for yourself and working at home. Are we going to see a generational change? Fingers crossed. I'm not hopeful, and normally I'm a very positive person. Is this current arrangement of labour a product of gender? Yes, because I think women in families have been picking up most of what's needed to be done with the homeschooling and the working from home and juggling everything. I'm not sure. I don't think that's changed. I think it's still. So I was trying to fit in a session with a client, and she's had to negotiate with her husband to pick up the children from nursery in order to have a session that's really important to her. And I'm just going, the husband could offer immediately. So I'm not confident, because I think it's really ingrained in our society, and it's going to need more than a major shift for it to change. I'm a product of, I live in Bristol at the moment. In 2 weeks' time, today will be my 2 weeks today will be my first proper day resident in York. I can get to work in London non-stop, 2-hour travel on LNER, which is very comfortable. So, and that's about the same time it would take from Bristol to London. I can actually travel a longer distance, still do my work, and even get down to Brighton to do work with the pensions regulator. Another probably an hour and a half. It's not a problem.
Yeah. Okay, so we're not. I mean, it as you say, realistically, whilst certain things are revolutionary, and as Jonathan said, perhaps we could really do with, if we're going to have a revolution, let's have one in the housing sector. But my goodness, let's make the other one about gender equality. Whilst we've seen perhaps a build up on the back of some very, very terrible developments and incidents, people being killed, but actually there's a sense perhaps that there's a moment or an awakening, but perhaps we're not going to see that sustained in terms of really following through. But we must, of course, take advantage of this dynamic that we have, I suppose, at this point.
Can I just add one thing onto
that?
There's been a lot in the news at the moment about the precautions that women should take to make sure they're safe out and about. And there has been a lot of discussion about it shouldn't be women having to make those choices and make those decisions and make those precautions happen. There's another partnership here. There's an element called men that need to wake up. And I think the same applies within organizations. It's more difficult for women, I think, to get promotion towards, all that. And then you talk about, people of, the black and brown people as well, which I understand is correct terminology at the moment. So it's not only diversity, it's inclusion as well. But somewhere along the line, we all need to wake up. And I was hearing someone the other day saying, people say that women should speak up. Well, yes, we should. And there should have been a woman's question first on that list today in the chat in order to get that voice out there. However, there's always two in a partnership, and we've got both men and women, and we need to work together. So for me, it's not an either or, it's how to get the diversity and the inclusion.
Thank you, Helena. Time, of course, as ever, starts to run away with us in these discussions. 90 minutes seems a long time, and before you know it, it's moved on and disappeared. So before it does disappear, rather briefly if you can, but I'd just like to come to each of you to reflect back on the questions that were set out for the event itself, which hopefully piqued your interest to be on the panel, but possibly some of the audience are looking for some answers too. So Alan, can you perhaps have a first shot at those questions? What took your interest?
Well, what took my interest was the first question. I think, again, I'm looking back to look forward and thinking about the 1980s. In the 1980s, futurologists were confidently predicting.
Sorry, Alan, can you just remind us what that question was?
Oh, yeah. How important is the length of the behaviour? How important is the length of the behaviour change experiment imposed by COVID-19 to the new expectations and dynamics of knowledge work? And what I started by saying is that in the early 1980s, futurologists were predicting, but the start of the new millennium, that's 2000, the majority of us would be working in what they called electronic cottages, with an emphasis on the home as the centre of activity, the centre of society. That didn't happen. However, we've faced potential tipping points in the past, and I'll just remind you of one. Think back to the year 2000. Can you remember when farmers and lorry drivers blockaded refineries in protest against rises in fuel prices? Reminiscent of today, of course. The crisis lasted only 8 days, but seizing that opportunity to sell more of its services, British Telecom, the largest provider of telephone services at the time, took out newspaper adverts encouraging people to work at home. To save on fuel, many did so. But the dispute was quickly resolved and everyone quickly returned back to work. Now, COVID-19 has been different for two reasons, and we've touched on some of these already. Its length. It's not lasted days, but months and months and months, meaning that many of us have got accustomed to working at home. Now, some have liked it and some haven't, a bit like Marmite. Some like it, some don't. Many have been working at home for the first time, often because they were previously not trusted to work off premises. And this was born out of the mentality, if you can't see them, they must be slacking. But for many, the experiment has worked. It's difficult to see how the clock can be turned back completely, as it was in the year 2000. And the latest ONS figures show that 29% of employees are still working at home because of the pandemic. Now, this is down from 49% at the height of the pandemic, but is still very high. So I can't see it falling back to its pre-pandemic levels. A fall, yes, but not a complete return. The second point that differs from the year 2000 is that technology has made this all easier. It's easy to forget the iPhone was launched in 2007, and the ability to make video calls on that device was added 3 years later in 2010. Holding video conference calls like this one with multiple callers on a laptop, smartphone, tablet is a more recent innovation. Zoom, we're using today, was only launched in April 2011 and Google Meet in February 2017, and Teams unveiled a month later again in 2017. So I'd just like to end by saying I think that necessity is the mother of invention. Well, the necessity is working at home to prevent the spread of coronavirus. So we've all had to get used to this new way of working. We've had to innovate. We've had to model our way along. And technology has certainly helped us to do so and has made it more sustainable than it was in the year 2000.
Splendid. Thanks, Alan. And I'm going to push the pace a little bit as we go through the rest of the panel, if I may. So, Helena, back to you for your thoughts on those questions.
Okay, so I'm addressing question 3 together with Jonathan and Joe, and it was how well are the evolving consequences of new ways of working for productivity, well-being and travel behaviour understood, and is this a moving target? So I started off by thinking it's not the time to use my favourite approach or technique, which is rock up and wing it. It really does need careful thinking about. And is it understood? I don't think at all. Absolutely don't at all. I don't think we've really got any idea at all of what we're having to cope with. I think we do, and that's where the traps lie. And I love the moving target concept, and yes, it is. And I think we need plans that are flexible. I think we need to experiment. I think we need to challenge assumptions. It's about how can we create certainty from the top down. People at the top of organisations, including the government and whatever, they need to be certain about what's happening. They really need to have thought it through a lot better than they are at the moment. It's considering what's the etiquette that's in and out. You know, that's that hokey cokey thing, I guess, really. An organisation, we talked about exclusivity and diversity before, but organisational cultures need to really embrace that and really address the gender balance and also the yes. And so doing things in the old way in a different location won't work. We need to experiment, we need to review, we need to reflect and rethink and reboot. We need to ensure that everyone is included in things, and it's communicate. I think work in progress. Everyone needs to be empowered. The trust thing, I think, comes up again. You need regular feedback loops to find out what's happening and how it can work. And it's finding the right fit for everyone, because we can have what we want, or we can have our reasons for not having it. And I think we're having our reasons for not having it at the moment.
Thanks, Helena. And Jonathan, on to you. And I suppose your muddling through phrase, which has captured people's imagination, maybe that's almost your answer, but anything you'd like to add? You know, how well understood are things, and given it's a moving target, how well understood might they eventually be?
Yes, it is a moving target. Yeah, and the problem is working from home is really bad, but it's really good. Working from office is really bad, but it's really good. Being on Teams calls all day is psychologically exhausting. There was a really interesting paper around that because the way our brains work. Commuting to the office every day is really exhausting, but just in a different way. Working from home is really, if I was younger than I am and I thought I was spending my next 40 years of my career, wherever it would be, in a small room in my house all the time, I wouldn't really relish that too much. But it can also suit other people's lifestyle. So yeah, we all kind of know this, which is why I think we'll end up kind of muddling through. And also, well, there's also the danger of a tyranny of the majority, because some people have very, very particular needs, whereas a lot of people may be able to fit around the general compromise. So there's all that, we kind of know that. But we'll come to some kind of outcome. Just a few other observations. I think the car share and car occupancy role, the low levels of car occupancy we have in this country, emphasised part of the wider transport mix. It's good that it featured in the transport decarbonisation plan, and it also got into the net zero strategy. I think COVID is a massive blow to that whole sector, but we need to regroup around that, because logically, if car is king or queen of modal share, which it is, and in some places it's the emperor, because in a lot of our geographies public transport share is minute, then logically, if you can get the car occupancy rate up even a relatively small amount, you can have a huge impact. So, and the public sector, I think, could play a major leadership role. All the people who work in health, education, local government, we could start with those sectors about driving up car occupancy rates alongside modal shifts, obviously. So I think there's more that could be brought out, and hopefully will be as we emerge from the immediate shocks and aftershocks of the pandemic.
And that's a segue. I'll slightly kind of orient an added question to Joe. So the notion of occupancy that Jonathan picked up, vehicle occupancy, which Malia will obviously have a view on. Your team, I'm assuming, were responsible in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan for reminding us about the latest behavioural research, and of course, cost and convenience once again come through very strongly as influencers. How are we seeing that occupancy levels are going to go up when costs are going down with electric vehicles for those who are wealthy enough to afford them, and there's not much constraint on car use for those who have ICE vehicles? So do you have any views on how, and I'm sorry that's kind of slightly off-piste from what you might be planning to say, but any views on how, from a behavioural point of view, occupancies really might change? And again, I know Malia will have a thought on this too, but
that's a really difficult one, Glenn. So yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult, particularly in this context where you know, we've looked with a lot of research on sort of confidence and how people feel in terms of their comfort in shared spaces with people. I think that's an additional challenge that COVID has brought along to this. Yeah, as with all of these things, yeah, cost, convenience, but I think it's also about all the other sort of complex factors that influence people's travel choices. So you know, it's about the activities that people take part in their lives, the places they do things, sort of the infrastructure around them. These are all the factors that influence people's travel choices, and I think what we need to have is to be a lot more people-centered, and to sort of do the research to really understand what people's travel needs are. We tend to fall back on the idea of cost quite a lot in transport, and I think ignore some of those other factors too much. I'm not sure that really addresses.
No, I think it does. I think it's a good reminder of how appealing a simple metric, which sounds very powerful, like vehicle occupancy, can be, and the notion that yes, increasing it's a good thing, but the route to doing so is fraught with kind of behavioural challenges, which you've outlined very nicely. Sorry, anything else you'd like to add in relation to the questions that we'd seen beforehand?
I think I mean, it's very much a moving target. We've got lots of data on what has been happening, but I think it goes back to, you know, what I've just said. The complex network of factors means that it's so difficult to predict the implications for transport. But I suppose what it demonstrates is that transport will need to adapt, and it could be in positive ways. You know, if transport becomes more flexible, for example, to meet people's more flexible travel needs, then that's good for everybody. You know, that could be around ticketing, or just being able to better meet people's different needs on different days, and for people to be able to change their behaviour at the last minute, which can sometimes you know, not be that so easy at the moment. And I think the other thing is the focus on sort of customer experience has been brought into sharp focus by the pandemic. And again, if we're more user focused and listen to what customers want, that's good for everybody. So yeah.
No, I think well, interesting, isn't it? Flexible working as a kind of core phrase at the heart of this discussion, but flexible transport surely goes hand in hand with that, which you've reminded us of very well there. Malia, what do you have to say on all of this, or thoughts on the questions beforehand?
So many things, but I'm going to try and keep it concise because I know we're running out of time. So I guess to go on the car occupancy theme, and I'm really, really thrilled, as we all are at LiftShare. We almost threw a party that the DFT has recognised the importance of increasing car occupancy. and the huge opportunity that we have here. So when we think about the reality, which is that 83% of car emissions comes from journeys that have no walking, no cycling, no public transport options at all, anything we can do to reduce the demand for those sorts of journeys that are over kind of 5 miles, but also then for where you can't reduce the demand when people need to travel, it's encouraging those journeys to be shared. It's going to be so vital if we have any chance of tackling the climate crisis from a commuting emissions perspective. So that's super important. I do completely agree with what Joe was saying around the people's perceptions, behaviours, the barriers to choosing a particular mode. All of the barriers that existed pre-pandemic with getting people lift sharing exist now, possibly more so, with that fear aspect. And it's absolutely the same for public transport. Why would you want to hop on a bus with 20 other people? It's kind of a scary place to be. So we are up against that, trying to look at what's motivating people and then aligning lift share with that. And the good news is that people's awareness of the climate crisis is on the up significantly. So my colleague Mark has a stats brain and he knows all the different statistics. I don't, but I know it's on the up. People's choices are changing from in terms of product choices from a sustainability angle. So I think there is a shift just that's happening within the psyche of the British public, and I'm hoping that will kind of follow through to the lift sharing aspect as well. Sorry, that was a bit like bleh, but yeah, lots to think on that one.
That's great, thanks Malia. I'll come to you all one final time for a kind of quick fire sentence about what your takeaway is, but if I can just take kind of chair's privilege to pick a few summing up points from what I've found to be everything I expected, a wonderfully rich conversation. I think it couldn't have better demonstrated that travel is a derived demand, and we so need to look upstream always to really make sense of how society is changing if we're going to have a better informed approach to designing the type of flexibility in our transport that Joe touched upon. I think we'll all remember Jonathan's phrase, muddling through, because it is a set of moving targets. The thing that's very clear for me is that there is no switch off of this experiment. The idea that we were in or are in an experiment is now misleading, because this is an open-ended journey ahead of us of continuous change with no doubt twists and turns. I think we've been reminded that there's an important distinction between tactical and strategic looking ahead. The muddling through reflect a lot of tactical behaviour just to survive or to cope or adjust as individuals and as organisations, but there's so much strategic opportunity and perhaps necessity for that. And in that context of taking opportunity, I think Halini used the phrase, the arrangement of labour is a product of gender. And that to me is very powerful. And when we come to the cooperation you referred to, that has to be a different balance of power between men and women in that rearrangement of labour. And for me, that brings me to, we're all alchemists, as you said. And I think we being us as individuals, our employers, but also government. And almost an added bonus is the prospect of levelling up by stealth that might come from this. So that's all from me. Really quick one-liner, if you don't mind, from each of you. So I'll just work along. Alan, perhaps come to you. What's your takeaway?
My takeaway is the genie is out of the bottle for those who previously were not allowed to work at home, but many have got used to this way of working. So it's difficult to see a complete return to pre-pandemic patterns of 9 to 5 office-based working, and hybrid is much more likely to be the future.
Thank you. Malia. Oh, sorry, we've fallen foul.
Crikey, I'm not as succinct as Alan there. I think the key thing that's resonating in my mind is flexibility. Of people want flexibility, individuals want flexibility, and collaboration. Collaboration, looking at lift sharing, cycling, walking, public transport. We all need to be working together to provide that flexibility to people. So that's what's kind of going around in my mind.
Thanks, Malia. Joe.
I would very much agree with Malia. I guess we're still in a very uncertain world. There's still lots of ifs and buts, but I think it's quite inspiring to think that there could be wider benefits to individuals and society if we do this well, which I think means mindfully and purposefully and trying things, but being aware of what we're trying and learning as we go along.
Great, well put. Thanks, Joe. And Jonathan, and then I'll come to you, Helena, to finish off for us.
I think there are some big opportunities here to align the outcomes from the pandemic with the wider goals that we have for climate and for fairness, but I think it will need to be based on a hard-headed assessment rather than a fantastic dream scenario about what trends are likely to emerge, and to be agile and clever about trying to shape some of those trends.
Great.
I think we'll need to wait a little bit longer to have greater surety about where those trends are heading, but there's some serious thinking to be done then about how to shape those outcomes.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Helena, right on the wire, some golden words of wisdom, please.
Okay. We're all responsible for our actions, and I'm looking at this as an exciting adventure, encouraging us all to be ultimately curious, to be open to discover the difference that will make the difference to our world.
Wonderful, thank you. And with that, before I hand back to Brogan, thanks to my panel hugely. I'm really grateful for the time and energy you brought to this. Huge thank you to our audience. This is what makes it so exciting, and what conversations you may have been having. And thank you to Brogan as ever for making sure this happens without faults and falling over. Brogan, back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. It was a great conversation. And I look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Bye, folks.